The play Sir Thomas More, Part 1. The 6 so-called signatures of William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. In the profound knowing words of Francis Bacon himself, from the moment you learn to speak, you are under the necessity of drinking in and assimilating what perhaps I may be allowed to call a hodgepodge of errors. Nor do these errors derive their strength only from popular usage. They are sanctioned by the institutions of academies, colleges, orders, and even states themselves. There are no surviving manuscripts, documents, letters, or any kind of literary work or personal items written in the hand of William Shakespeare of Stratford in existence. According to orthodox Shakespeare scholars, the only extant specimens of his handwriting consist of 6 undisputed autograph signatures found on legal documents. One on a deposition in the Bellot v. Mountjoy case dated 11th of May 1612, 2 for the purchase deed and mortgage documents relating to a house in Blackfriars, London in 1613, 3 on his last will and testament dated 1616. These signatures, written and spelt differently by, it would appear, different hands or by legal representatives, signing the documents on his behalf, because William Shakespeare was not able to do so himself. For more than a century, orthodox Shakespeare scholars have misleadingly, falsely and fraudulently stated, to reinforce the belief systems of their indoctrinated readers, that there are 6 surviving signatures of undisputed authenticity that have come down to us in the hand of William Shakespeare, i.e. William Shakespeare of Stratford. These knowingly untruthful and deceitful statements serve as an indispensable bulwark against the so-called anti-Stratfordians, who insist William Shakespeare of Stratford was not the author of the Shakespeare plays and was illiterate or semi-illiterate. It is often said it is never wise to underestimate the stupidity of humankind, but surely in the fullness of time it will be eventually realised that nothing could ever compete with the absurdity of the greatest literary fraud of all time, that William Shakespeare wrote the Shakespeare plays. If only on the basis that his own parents, John and Mary Shakespeare, were illiterate, as were his 3 children, Susanna, Judith and Hamnet. So, the literary prowess of the Shakespeare family runs: illiterate, illiterate, the world's greatest writer, illiterate, illiterate and illiterate. Lord, such fools these mortals be. The desperate need of the Stratfordian authorities to state and insist that some or all of these so-called signatures are written in the hand of William Shakespeare is from their perspective absolutely necessary. Because if the man from Stratford was not able to write or sign his own name, it would confirm he was illiterate and not the author of the Shakespeare works. These 6 disputed signatures are obviously the last line of defence and the last stand of the fraudulent Stratfordians. And reinforce their desperate need for something else to point towards in the hand of William Shakespeare on the basis of these very much disputed 6 signatures. The Stratfordian authorities, with a supporting cast of Shakespeare scholars, also inform everyone that his hand is the same, or probably the same, as the so-called hand D in the manuscript of the play Sir Thomas More. More than 400 years after it was written, the hidden truth about the authorship and provenance of the Shakespeare play entitled Sir Thomas More and the so-called Hand D in its surviving manuscript is finally revealed for the first time. During 1604, William Shakespeare was lodging with the family of Christopher Mountjoy, a Huguenot maker of fashionable headdresses, at the corner of Silver Street and Mugwell Street, near St Olave's Church in Cripplegate, then enclosed within the northwest corner of the City of London. His daughter Mary Mountjoy and his apprentice Stephen Bellott, who also lived in the house, were encouraged by William Shakespeare to get married, an event which occurred on the 19th of November 1604. Unfortunately, Stephen Bellott and his father-in-law quarrelled about the non-payment of his daughter's dowry. According to Bellott, his father-in-law had promised him £60 on the marriage, and after Mountjoy's death, an inheritance of £200 left in his will. Instead, Mountjoy had given him only £10 and some old household stuff. Fearing that Mountjoy was going to cut them out of his will, Stephen and Mary instigated a legal suit that was heard by the court in the spring of 1612. It is from the documents of the court case that we have the earliest of the 6 so-called signatures of William Shakespeare. Members, servants and apprentices of the Mountjoy household in the City of London had known William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, who had also been a lodger in their house for at least a decade, some of whom submitted depositions in a court case a decade later in 1612. And not one of them in the duration of this legal hearing once referred to him as the renowned and celebrated poet and playwright William Shakespeare, the darling of the London literati, whose plays had lit up its major well-attended theatres. Finally, to cap it all, in one of these court documents, the supposed world's greatest writer apparently signed his own name, William Shakespeare. The second and third of the so-called signatures of William Shakespeare of Stratford are found on the purchase deed of a mysterious residence in Blackfriars, London, dated 10th of March 1613, and on the mortgage of the same house dated the day after on the 11th of March 1613. There is something very curious about the purchase of this property by William Shakespeare and his reasons for purchasing it. All is not what it seems, and there is much more to it than meets the eye, in a transaction which includes the documented involvement of 2 members of the Bacon family, Anne Bacon and her son Matthias Bacon, in a partly fictitious legal procedure conceivably directed by the invisible hand of the great lawyer of the family, the Solicitor General Francis Bacon. All the evidence points to and confirms that in 1613 William Shakespeare was living in Stratford-upon-Avon, and for some reason he then curiously decides to travel up to London to purchase a property at Blackfriars, one which he has no intention of using or living in. The common reason put forward to account for this by orthodox scholars is that Shakespeare purchased it for an investment, in support of which they state he was only following the example of Richard Burbage, who had invested in several property ventures in the same district. There is, however, much more to this transaction carried out in the name of William Shakespeare than meets the eye. The account of the Bacon family involvement in the ownership of the Blackfriars property in London, purchased by William Shakespeare of Stratford, stretches back to the time of Sir Nicholas Bacon, born and raised in the county of Suffolk. The Bacon family had long established and extensive roots in Suffolk that included the Bacons who lived 10 miles down the road in Lavenham, including his relative and contemporary Thomas Bacon of Lavenham, down whose genealogical line can be traced ownership of the Blackfriars house purchased in the name of William Shakespeare. The Blackfriars property was left to Margaret Bacon, who resided there, and following her death she bequeathed the property to Anne Bacon, whose husband was Thomas Bacon, formerly Sergeant of the Acatry to Queen Mary. Her husband Thomas Bacon of Lavenham became Sergeant of the Acatry during the reign of Queen Mary, whom Lady Anne Cook Bacon served as a gentlewoman of the Queen's Privy Chamber. The Blackfriars property came into the possession of the son of Thomas and Anne Bacon, one Matthias Bacon of Gray's Inn, in 1590. Very little is known about Matthias Bacon. He was admitted to Gray's Inn 1st of March 1597, the main residence of Francis Bacon at No. 1 Gray's Inn Square, who occupied the quarters built by his father, Lord Keeper Sir Nicholas Bacon. During the previous 2 decades in his role as the de facto master of the revels of Gray's Inn, Bacon wrote and produced various plays, masques and other dramatic devices, most recently organising the Gray's Inn Christmas Revels of 1594-5, where he premiered his Shakespeare play The Comedy of Errors. On account of their filial links, Matthias Bacon most likely resided with Bacon in his spacious quarters, and for the many years Matthias spent at Gray's Inn, he was undoubtedly in regular contact with its favourite alumni Francis, with whom he must have formed a very close relationship in the subsequent years and decades. In 1604, Matthias Bacon sold, or passed apparent ownership, of the Blackfriars property to Henry Walker, who in turn entered into a contract to apparently dispose of it to William Shakspere of Stratford, 9 years later in 1613, the only London residence owned by Bacon's literary mask, whom he used as a pseudonym for his Shakespeare poems and plays. Which gives rise to the question, did William Shakspere of Stratford also act as a front for Bacon in purchasing the Blackfriars property? Whatever the true reason, in March 1613, William Shakspere entered into a legal process for the purchasing of the Blackfriars property close to the Blackfriars Theatre that was part of the enormous Dominican Priory estate. As previously seen in the Bellot v. Mountjoy court case the year before, William Shakspere is here again described as a gentleman of Stratford-upon-Avon in the county of Warwick. In the indenture, the vendor Henry Walker is described as a minstrel, William Johnson as a London vintner, and John Jackson and John Hemming as London gentlemen. Whereas the supposed greatest poet and dramatist of the era, whose plays were performed at the Globe Theatre and the Blackfriars Theatre just a walk away from the Blackfriars property, in the contract to purchase it, is merely described as a gentleman of Stratford-upon-Avon. The conveyance document stipulated that for the Blackfriars Gatehouse, William Shakspere of Stratford-upon-Avon purchased the property for £140, of which £80 was paid in cash. The dwelling house or tenement, part of which was erected over a great gate right up against the King's Majesty's wardrobe and abutted on a street leading down to Puddle Wharf, leading to a capital messuage, which sometime was in the tenure William Blackwell, Esquire, deceased, and since that in the tenure or occupation of the Right Honourable Henry, now Earl of Northumberland, and also all that plot of ground on the west side of the same tenement, which was lately enclosed with boards on 2 sides thereof by Anne Bacon, widow so far and in such sort as the same was enclosed by Anne Bacon and not otherwise. The Right Honourable Henry Percy, 9th Earl of Northumberland, otherwise known as the Wizard Earl due to his interests in mathematics and science, enjoyed a close friendship with Bacon that went back many years. It was in the London house of one of Northumberland's descendants that Bacon's own collection of manuscripts was later discovered by John Bruce and published by his great editor James Spedding. This Bacon collection of manuscripts, known as the Northumberland manuscript, originally held copies of his 2 Shakespeare plays, Richard II and Richard III. In addition to originally having held 2 of Bacon's Shakespeare plays, Richard II and Richard III, the outer cover of his collection of manuscripts contains references and links to his narrative Shakespeare poem, The Rape of Lucrece, and another 3 of his Shakespeare plays, Love's Labour's Lost, Romeo and Juliet, and The Merchant of Venice. This is the only manuscript where the names Bacon and Shakespeare appear together in a contemporary document. Returning to the deed of sale between Henry Walker and William Shakspere of Stratford, it reads, "Which said dwelling house or tenement and other the premises above by these presents mentioned to be bargained and sold, the said Henry Walker late purchased and had to him his heirs and assigns for ever of Matthias Bacon of Gray's Inn in the county of Middlesex, gentleman, by indenture bearing the date the 15th day of October, unto the said William Shakspere, William Johnson, John Jackson, and John Hemming." The other three co-purchasers, William Johnson, John Jackson, and John Hemming, were trustees with Shakspere, the purchaser of the Blackfriars dwelling. William Johnson was the landlord of the Freemasonic Mermaid Tavern, frequented by Bacon, Grand Master of England Inigo Jones, lawyers, parliamentarians, and the poets Ben Jonson and Hugh Holland, who contributed 2 verses to the Shakespeare First Folio. According to which orthodox Shakespeare scholar you read, John Hemming was likely, probably, or almost certainly the actor John Hemming of the King's Men. What they do not mention is that the whole bedrock of the Shakespeare First Folio is predicated on the fiction that 7 years after the death of Shakespeare, his acting friends John Hemmings and Henry Condell edited the folio and wrote its dedication to the Grand Master of England, William Herbert, and the address to the great variety of readers to which their names are signed. That was all part of the charade created by Bacon and his Rosicrucian Freemasonry Brotherhood to conceal his true authorship behind the mask of William Shakespeare. Of course, the actors Hemmings and Condell did not organise and oversee the enormous enterprise and production of the Shakespeare First Folio, but merely allowed their names to be put below its 2 epistles. This instrument or deed of sale was signed by William Johnson, John Jackson, and allegedly by William Shakspere, whose crabbed signature appeared as William Shaxp. Following the conveyance of the Blackfriars dwelling house, the next day, on the 11th of March 1613, another legal document was required for the mortgage of the property. Most likely all part of a legal charade directed by Bacon, with Shakspere acting as a front for him, with the trustees Jackson, Johnson and Hemming acting as controlling and directing mechanisms working on his behalf. The legal instrument is signed by William Johnson and John Jackson, and with a signature which is different to the signature William Shaxp in the deed of sale, again supposedly by William Shakspere, in what appears to be in a different hand this time, with a truncated form of his Christian name as W.M. Shakespeare. Again, throughout this mortgage document on the Blackfriars property, one in walking distance of the Blackfriars Theatre, where the Shakespeare plays were regularly performed, in which William Shakspere of Stratford-upon-Avon was referred to on more than half a dozen occasions. Not once is he described as the poet and dramatist William Shakespeare. 2 years later, in April 1615, with Anne Bacon being lately dead, a petition was submitted to the Court of Chancery to Bacon's close friend and professional colleague, Lord Chancellor Sir Thomas Egerton. The petition addressed to Lord Chancellor Thomas Egerton names William Shakespeare, Gent, and Richard Bacon, citizen of London, to direct Matthias Bacon of Gray's Inn to surrender the letters, patents, and other deeds relating to the messages, tenements, and premises of the Blackfriars property herein. All which messages, tenements, and premises aforesaid by lying with the precinct of Blackfriars in the City of London or County of Middlesex, late the messages, tenements, and inheritances of William Blackwell the elder, Henry Blackwell, and William Blackwell the younger, and of Anne Bacon. The defendant, Matthias Bacon, did not dispute the complainant's rights to the property, and stated that he did not now claim to have any right, title, in interest in the said premises. On the 22nd of May, the Court of Chancery decreed the surrender of the papers to Sir Thomas Bendish, Edward Newport, and the other plaintiffs. These legal proceedings are what is known as only friendly litigation, with the object of covering Matthias Bacon with the authority of the Court of Chancery in handing over the title deeds of the property and of the larger estate of which it had formed a part. Two years after the death of William Shakespeare, on the 10th of February 1618, John Jackson, William Johnson and John Hemming conveyed the Blackfriars property in trust to John Green of Clements and Matthew Morris. Trust in them reposed by William Shakespeare, deceased, late of Stratford, aforesaid gent, according to the true intent and meaning of the last will and testament of the said William Shakespeare, on the behalf of Susanna Hall, one of the daughters of the said William Shakespeare, all that dwelling house or tenement with the appurtenances situate and being within the precinct, circuit and compass of the late Blackfriars, London, which was lately enclosed by the said Anne Bacon. In every single one of these legal documents, while he was still alive and after his death, in which William Shakespeare of Stratford was referred to countless times, he is never once equated with the great poet and dramatist William Shakespeare, even in the last of these, which involved his daughter Susanna Shakespeare and her husband Dr. John Hall. Meanwhile, with the purchase and mortgage of the Blackfriars property being completed, Francis Bacon was busy carrying out other secret work with his Rosicrucian Brotherhood. We know from Bacon's private memoranda or notebook that much of its works needed to be carried out in secret, prescripts touching secrecy, tradition and publication. One of these secret publications appeared at Kassel in Germany in 1614, its first Rosicrucian manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis. Very deliberately, the secret founding father of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood and author of the anonymous Fama, in an unequalled masterstroke to deflect attention away from himself and its secret English origins, to further misdirect the eye, arranged for its publication in Germany. The second anonymous Rosicrucian manifesto, the Confessio, appeared in Latin at Kassel in Germany in 1615 and contains a piece of devastating information never mentioned by the Stratfordian orthodoxy. Its secret anonymous author, Bacon, points out how easy it is to deceive with enigmas and illusions, one of them being of his own creation, which has misled and beguiled the sleepy universities and academia around the globe for centuries. And it contains the line, "Our age doth produce many such, one of the greatest being a stage player, a man with sufficient ingenuity for imposition." The passage written by Bacon directly refers to his literary mask, the actor William Shakespeare of Stratford, as an imitator, impersonator or impostor. It raises the veil of secrecy that lies behind the Rosicrucian ludibrium and illusion that the illiterate, semi-illiterate William Shakespeare of Stratford was the author of the greatest literature in the history of the world. An illusion directed and monitored by Bacon, who used William Shakespeare as a front and whom, in secret, behind the scenes, carefully watched over him in life and in death. In 1615, the year Bacon arranged for the publication of the Confessio, written in Latin, wherein it refers to William Shakespeare as an impostor, the Stratford man was apparently contemplating his own mortality and the drawing up of his last will and testament. At the beginning of 1616, it is believed that he summoned the services of the lawyer Francis Collins to draft and execute it. The original will, if it be the original, dated 25th of March 1616, was submitted to the Prerogative Court of Canterbury in London, probated on the 22nd of June and entered in the register shortly after, now held at the National Archives in London. With virtually the rest of humankind consumed and distracted by the Second World War, In April 1940, Archibald Stalker set forth a long-forgotten, ignored and suppressed article entitled "Is Shakespeare's Will a Forgery?" in the Quarterly Review, in which, as its title denotes, raised the question, was the will of William Shakespeare of Stratford a forgery? Forgery of documents is as old as history and very common. Sir Sidney Lee gave in Appendix 1 to his Life of William Shakespeare a long list of forgeries in regard to matters appertaining to the poet. It is curious that Shakespeare's will is nearly everything that a will should not be, and that as far as I've been able with extensive reading to discover, no single person has ever investigated the question of its genuineness. It is as defective a document as ever went unchallenged in the courts of law and literature. It contains many deletions and insertions not authenticated by signature, initials, or final testing clause. It shows change of mind and bequest also unauthenticated. It is apparently a second draft, but even after the second draft was completed, Shakespeare had not made up his mind about his intentions. Its mangled condition signifies that Shakespeare was helpless, that neither he nor the lawyer consulted the poet's son-in-law, Dr. Hall, about the form of the document, and that Dr. Hall took no interest in it, though he was to be an executor and was vitally interested in seeing that the will, being very much in his wife's favour and much to the disadvantage of Judith Shakespeare, her sister, should be valid. It appears that no other relative was in a position to demand from the lawyer a proper document, though 4 hours would have sufficed to produce one, and as Shakespeare lived about a month after the date of the will, he certainly could have signed a proper one. The will of William Shakespeare of Stratford consists of 3 pages, the first of which has been completely rewritten for reasons which are not immediately altogether clear. It is an untidy document, unpunctuated and unparagraphed, with a significant number of interlineations and crossings out or cancellations. Changes in the will are not signed or initialled and are written with a different pen and ink than that used in the rest of it. There are also other serious irregularities, some of which have been described as fraudulent or out-and-out forgeries, signatures not being as presented, and other anomalies, which we will have occasion to address below. But first, let us survey what was left in the will that has come down to us. It is what is missing in the last will and testament of William Shakespeare of Stratford, supposed to be the great poet and dramatist Shakespeare, that is of greatest significance. There is no item in the will which pertains to his life as an actor, save a bequest of money for the 3 fellow actors, John Hemming, Richard Burbage and Henry Condell, inserted by way of an interlineation squeezed between the lines after the will was originally written, and we might very well ask by whom. There is also no mention of the valuable shares in the Globe and Blackfriars Theatre, perhaps because in reality Shakespeare merely served as a front for Bacon, the true owner of the shares in the 2 London theatres. There is no mention of the manuscripts of the Shakespeare poems and plays or the printed Shakespeare quartos, 18 of which appeared during his lifetime, and no mention of valuable books. This is a truly astonishing anomaly, considering that the author of the Shakespeare works must have owned a library full of literally hundreds of books that were part of his reading and known to have been used as sources for his poems and plays. In the will, there were bequests made to Thomas Russell and Francis Collins, both of whom were also nominated overseers of the document. In Elizabethan and Jacobean England, Thomas Russell moved in the same circles of Sir Toby Mathew and his close friend Francis Bacon, at whose behest and under whose direction Russell might well have been appointed the overseer of William Shakespeare's last will and testament. It is believed that the will is written in one hand, although this is by no means certain, in two kinds of ink, one darker than the other. Most so-called handwriting authorities or experts believe that all the emendations are in the same hand. However, the interlineations written in the darker ink were possibly made by a different hand than to the rest of the will, including the suspicious bequests made to Burbage, Hemming and Condell, inserted after the page had been written out. The first page has evidently been completely rewritten. The handwriting at the foot of the first page is cramped, coming down to the bottom margin, with the top of page 2 commencing with 2 lines higher up than the other pages of the will, followed by a cancelled passage which bears no relation to what now precedes it, and then there is the third page with more signs of fraud and forgery. On the final page of the will, we read that Francis Bacon's relative Thomas Russell, Esquire, and Francis Collins, Gent, were appointed its overseers. At this time, Bacon was Attorney General and soon to be Lord Keeper and Lord Chancellor, under whose jurisdiction Collins would fall and whose authority he ultimately answered to. Followed by the statement, "And I do revoke all former wills and publish this to be my last will and testament." The will is signed by 5 witnesses: Francis Collins, Julius Shaw, John Robinson, Hamnet Sadler and Robert Watcott. Aside from Collins, the other 4 signatures are written with the same pen and ink. It was clear to Archibald Stalker that one man wrote the 4 signatures. The R in Robinson is a very tricky, swiftly written R, with a horizontal line for what should be the final curve, and it can be seen exactly repeated several times in the will. Other resemblances could no doubt be found. The 4 signatures are the same script in size, shape, slope, proportions, and are in the handwriting of the will itself. The signature of Collins is the same handwriting, merely put on a different slope and a little disguised. As these names were not signatures, there were no witnesses to the signature by Shakespeare of this mangled document, and I do not see how it could stand as a legal instrument if it had been challenged. All 3 pages of the will carry a signature, supposedly by William Shakespeare, with all 3 signed and spelt differently, from the man supposed to be the greatest writer in the history of the world. These are again different from the other 3 signatures found in the deposition of the Bellot versus Mountjoy case and conveyance and mortgage documents relating to the Blackfriars property. The British lawyer and voluminous Baconian writer Sir Edwin Durning Lawrence, who was very familiar with legal documents and wills, subjected the Shakespeare will and the other 3 signatures to a close examination. He immediately points to the statement on the last page of the will, "Witness to the publishing," and the names of the witnesses below it, which he states are not signatures and are all in the same handwriting of the will, showing that Shakespeare's witnesses were also unable to write their names. Regarding the 3 signatures on the will that he had examined under strong magnifying glasses, look first at the upper writings and never again call them signatures. As for the 2 signatures on the deed of purchase and mortgage document of the Blackfriars dwelling house, neither of these documents states that it was signed, but only that it was sealed, and it was at that date in no way necessary that any signatures should be written over the seals, but the clerks might, and evidently did, place upon these deeds an abbreviated name of William Shakespeare over the seal on each document. With the permission of the Corporation of London, the intrepid Durning Lawrence arranged for the librarian and the chairman of the Library Committee to transfer the purchase deed to the British Museum, to place it side by side with the mortgage deed. After they had, with myself and the museum authorities, most carefully examined the two deeds, the librarian of the City Corporation said to me, "There is no reason to suppose that the corporation deed has upon it the signature of William Shakespeare." And the British Museum authorities likewise told me that they did not think that the museum mortgage deed had upon it a signature of William Shakespeare. The more you examine the whole five, the more you will be certain, as the writer is, after the most careful study of the will and of the deeds, that not one of the five writings is a signature or pretends to be a signature, and that therefore there is a probability, practically amounting to a certainty, that the Stratford actor could not so much as manage to scrawl his own name. Before his work went to press, Dunning-Lawrence was able to see at the Public Record Office the documents recently discovered by Dr. C.W. Wallace, which prove beyond all possibility that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, gentleman, was able to write even so much as any portion of his own name. On the bottom of the answer to the interrogatories, the so-called signature of Wilm Shakespeare is written by the lawyer or law clerk, and is clearly written in the same hand that wrote the interrogatories. On closely examining all the so-called 6 signatures, Sir Edwin Dunning-Lawrence delivered his damning verdict. Thus the question whether William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, gentleman, could or could not write his name is forever settled in the negative, and there is no doubt, there can be no doubt, upon this matter. In 1985, the Principal Assistant Keeper of the Public Record, Jane Cox of the Public Record Office, the long-time custodians of the last will and testament of Shakespeare, in her official capacity, dared say out loud what had been staring the custodians of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in the face for the last 2 centuries, that some or all of the so-called Shakespeare signatures are not from the hand of the same man. 6 authenticated Shakespeare signatures survive, and 3 of these are on his will. There is one on the Court of Requests document in the Public Record Office, and the 2 others are on deeds connected with the purchase of the Blackfriars House in the British Library and the Guildhall Library, respectively. It is obvious at a glance that these signatures, with the exception of the last 2, claimed by others to have been written by legal representatives or clerks, are not the signature of the same man. Almost every letter is formed in a different way in each. Which of the signatures reproduced here is the genuine article is anybody's guess. The anti-Stratfordians have argued that Shakespeare did not sign the documents himself because he was illiterate, or that he did sign them, but because he was not used to writing, each time the signature and the spelling was different. An article by Sir Hilary Jenkinson, published in 1922, gives a clue to what the solution might be. It was his opinion that clerks taking down the evidence of witnesses in lawsuits often signed it the deponent's name themselves, using a different hand from that which they had used for the body of the text to give it an air of verisimilitude. So much for the signature on the deposition given by Shakespeare to the Court of Requests. If this was the practice in the equity courts, why should it not have been the practice of attorneys' clerks when drawing up conveyancing documents? Possibly Shakespeare was not even in London to sign the mortgage deed and the deed of purchase for the Blackfriars Gatehouse. The will signatures have been regarded as sacrosanct in the main, but in the light of Sir Hilary Jenkinson's observations and practices in the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, the authenticity of even these signatures must be questioned. There is a possibility that the so-called original will is a facsimile copy made either by the court or by Collins's clerk. Another possibility is that the clerk who wrote the will forged Shakespeare's signatures. If one must select one of the 4 documents as being a sole example of the greatest playwright's hand, the will has no better claim than the request deposition, the mortgage deed, or the Guildhall conveyance. The marked discrepancies between the signatures lend credence to the views of most extreme anti-Stratfordians. Could this man write his own name, let alone anything else? The life, the last will, and the death of the illiterate, semi-illiterate Shakespeare of Stratford was carefully watched over by the true author of the Shakespeare works, Francis Bacon, and his Rosicrucian Brotherhood. Ratification of it arrived in 1616, the year in which Bacon's front and literary mask Shakespeare died, in the form of a rare Rosicrucian work published at Amsterdam. The enigmatic publication has 50 illustrations with Latin verses beneath them. Emblem 1 sees Fortune standing upon a globe, with one hand pushing from the pinnacle of fame a man dressed as an actor with a feather in his hat, and the other raising up a man wearing the familiar Bacon hat whose face remains hidden. Confirmation it is Bacon arrives from the initial letters in the 9th and 10th lines of the verse, an anagram of F. Bacon, as secret concealed author of the Shakespeare works. Two years later, a work intimately related to the Plempi emblem was also set forth by Bacon and his Rosicrucian Brotherhood. On the frontispiece it will be noticed that on either side of the temple of the Rosy Cross are two figures, one wearing a tall hat with a large rose being hauled out of a dark well where he was previously hidden, and another figure falling off a high rock. The two figures represent the same two figures in the Plempi emblem, where the identity of Bacon is confirmed by the anagram in its verse, and where the other, dressed as an actor, represents the impostor William Shakespeare, alluded to in the second Rosicrucian manifesto, the Confessio. A few years later, Francis Bacon published the Shakespeare First Folio, the greatest Rosicrucian Freemasonic work in the history of the world, behind his mask Shakespeare of Stratford, a Rosicrucian ludibrium that still deceives and fools the ordinary schoolman, academia, and virtually the rest of the world to the present day.